Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we discuss and explore the world of international relations, one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. Today's discussion focuses on Moscow's strategic engagement across the African continent, and we will discuss about Russia's historical ties with Africa, its current diplomatic and economic initiatives, and the implication of its involvement in African affairs. My guest today is Steven Gruzd. Hello.
Hi, Martin. Thanks so much for having me.
Steven Gruzd is the head of the African Governance and Diplomacy Program and the Russia-Africa Project at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Gruzd has authored influential analysis about Africa-Russia summits, BRICS cooperation, and the re-emergence of Russian influence in African foreign policy. In addition to this policy work, Mr. Gruzd is also a contributing journalist to the South African Jewish Report, where he writes on the international affairs, governance, and the Jewish community issues. So let's start with the first question, and let's explore how Russia's footprint in Africa is emerging, is developing. And my first question goes to Soviet era. So, Steven, how have historical ties from the Soviet era shaped Russian contemporary policy toward African states? Is this Soviet era still sort of perceived in Africa, or is it forgotten by the young African leaders?
Thank you, and that's a great place to start. As we know, Africa was definitely a theater of the Cold War, which emerged after 1945, and it was a terrain where Russia, the Europeans, the Americans were all competing for influence. And we all are aware that Russia or the Soviet Union was a strong supporter of liberation movements, particularly in the region that I come from, Southern Africa. I'm joining you from Johannesburg today. The Soviet Union provided diplomatic support, which was very important, but also weapons, political support, and some economic support to liberation movements that were trying to throw off the yoke of colonialism, and in particular of white settler rule. So right across the continent, from Angola to Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, there was Soviet involvement in these liberation movements. After they came to power, and in fact, all of them are still in power in those countries that I mentioned. So the MPLA in Angola, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, SWAPO in Namibia, the ANC in South Africa, and FRELIMO in Mozambique. Those are the five main liberation movements, and they still retain contact and meet as liberation movements. They are all in power in their respective countries and have been since the end of white rule. So they're very entrenched and ensconced, and because they had a favorable reputation and memories of the Soviet Union, what we see today is many of those ties being rekindled. Some of the freedom fighters were trained in the Soviet Union. Ironically, several of them were trained in places like Odessa in Ukraine. So the argument that Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union is refuted by the Ukrainians, who say, hold on a bit, we were also part of the Soviet Union, and we also got involved in the liberation struggle. But I think there is a romanticism for that time amongst some African political elites. They look back on that time very fondly, and I think Russia has certainly done its best to capitalize on those links. So many of today's leaders in Africa went to university in the Soviet Union or had frequent visits there. So those Soviet era ties are definitely being rekindled because, of course, and I'm sure we're going to get into it, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 1990s was a very quiet period for Russia on the international stage. And it pulled back, it sent fewer diplomats to Africa. It may have even closed some embassies. It was very inwardly focused in the 90s before President Putin came to power in 2000 or 1999, I think.
And as you mentioned, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have Russia and all those former Soviet republics. So African leaders, do they perceive those republics still under Russian influence, or they basically try to collaborate with them in a more independent way? So let's clarify this post-Soviet narrative in Africa.
Yes, I think ties with the former republics of the Soviet Union are probably quite minimal. It's so far away geographically. I don't think there's any ideological objection, but really at the moment, I'm not sure what Kazakhstan or Tajikistan really has in common with South Africa. Of course, they are non-Western countries, and South Africa likes to emphasize its non-Western credentials. And I'm sure there are some relations, but they're not at anywhere near the scale of Africa's relations with its former colonial powers, the European Union, Russia, China, the US. And there are many new players in Africa, including Turkey, including the Gulf states, including Israel, including Iran, South Korea. There's a lot of jostling, but I don't, in my mind, hear about the former Soviet republics really interacting very closely with South Africa. There may be visits from their leaders, but we don't hear about that very often. In fact, here at my institute, one of our former colleagues, he's passed on now, Dr. Tom Wheeler, was actually South Africa's ambassador to Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and several of the other countries. And I know about them from that. But yeah, I think contact is minimal, maybe a little bit more with Azerbaijan because they hosted the COP last year. And perhaps some of them are members of the non-aligned movement. But really, I think there is a big equation of the Russia today with the Soviet Union of yesterday in the minds of leaders and African elites. And again, I say Ukraine has sought to emphasize that, in fact, many freedom fighters were trained in Odessa and other places in Ukraine, and so that the monopoly on the narrative of supporting liberation movements should not be only with today's Russia.
Steven, when we speak about Africa, outside of Africa, many people, they immediately think about Wagner Group in regarding the security and geopolitical ties. However, this Wagner Group is portrayed in many dimensions as a good force for Africa, as a security private firm, as a company that has nothing to do with the government. So this needs a little bit of elaboration and clarification. So let's speak about this. And what are your thoughts about Russia's security footprint in Africa? And maybe if you can also clarify that Wagner Group.
Well, Russia's security footprint is definitely increasing. We saw, as I mentioned, in the 1990s, mostly under Boris Yeltsin, relations cooled and were neglected as Russia was dealing with so many internal problems. With President Putin, and particularly, I think, since his second term, there's been a renewed interest of Russia in Africa. We've also seen when there have been wars that Russia has participated in, like in Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014, and then again Crimea in 2022. We've seen the relations spike up as Western markets have become close to Russia in all sorts of spheres because of sanctions. It has sought economic relations, cultural relations, and so forth with the developing world, and Africa is no exception on that. The Wagner Group is indeed a presence on the African continent, most noticeably, I think, in the Central African Republic, where it has really been keeping the president in power and try to pacify what has been a very vicious and difficult civil war in that country. The Wagner Group has links, of course, to the late Yevgeny Prigozhin. And in its early stages, you're right, the Russian government disavowed any contact with it, said that these were private companies that had nothing to do with the state. Since his death, we've seen a gradual transformation of the Wagner Group into what's called the Africa Corps now, using a name that was actually used by the Germans in the Second World War. But there has been now acknowledgement of Wagner by the Russian state, and more centralized control since Prigozhin's death to organize its operations. So it operates in the Central African Republic. There were some troops or some soldiers in Mozambique, but after the killing of 3 of them, they withdrew very quickly. But we do see a lot of private military contractors in West Africa, particularly in the Sahel region, where the Sahara meets the forests of Africa. So in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, we do see these Russian troops operating, these Russian contractors operating. It's not entirely clear. I think it's not a very transparent operation. So to give you definitive answers, I can give you what I perceive and what I understand. And also in West Africa, we've seen the very interesting phenomenon when people have risen up against their government and also against France for its post-colonial, or some would say neo-colonial relationship with many of the French-speaking countries in West Africa. We've seen them waving Russian flags and holding pictures of President Putin. So I think in many ways, the African public in West Africa was fed up with their governments. Russia seemed to offer an alternative and some hope. And of course, there has also been a lot of an information war going on in West Africa, as in other parts of Africa, where competing narratives are trying to get traction. And Russia has invested money in for example, RT French, which broadcasts to that part of the world. There's been West African journalists that have trained in Russia. There have been agreements to share footage with West African media houses and so forth. And so the presence is very real. So these people who were so fed up with their own government were waving Russian flags, which was quite a surprise to many. But I think the more you look into it, there is a Russian footprint in these trouble spots. And on the more conventional side, Russia has military agreements with at least 20 African countries. And when the Russian-Africa summits happen, there's always a big area where there are the latest Russian weaponry that people can see and touch and climb on. So there are indeed arms deals going on between Russia and African countries.
I'm glad you mentioned arms deals because after the invasion and everything was going on in Ukraine, there was some cancellation of the military or arm contract with Russia worldwide. How the Ukraine conflict impact that sphere in Africa? Have you heard about any African states or companies that were canceling deals with Russians? Or it is opposite, that they are trying to get Russian weapons?
That's a good question, and I'm not a military expert, so I would imagine there's probably a mixture of that going on. I think Russia has had to focus its military production on the domestic market because for the last 3 years, I haven't heard of any deals being cancelled, but then I also have not heard of any new deals being struck. So I guess it's kind of frozen. But over history, Russia has been a big supplier, particularly to North African countries like Algeria and Egypt. Very significant military sales. But my sense is that this has been frozen. It's neither had a dramatic collapse nor has it had a dramatic increase. So it's my sense that it's on a plateau. But again, I'm not a military expert, and I'm sure somebody with more facts and figures could contradict me. But that's my sense. It's again a period where Russia is mostly looking inwards to me, apart from its I think Russia is trying to consolidate and trying to end the war, I guess, in Ukraine, and that has diverted its military attention.
Let's speak a little bit about the economic influence and economic footprint. And this is quite interesting for me because when I speak with my students, they can immediately answer that question when I mention China. They name the projects, the industrial big mega projects in Africa and investment. But when I ask about Russia, they struggle a little bit. So let's put some light into this. And can you please explain how Russia is doing in its economic influence in Africa? And perhaps you might have some comparison with China so we can better understand the style, how Russia is trying to get involved in Africa.
Yeah. Well, to start with China first, in the last 2.5 decades, definitely since the year 2000, you've seen Chinese trade go from here to here, even out of the screen. It has increased year by year. It is very significant. It is probably the main trading partner of many African countries. It's doing well over $200 billion of trade per year at the moment, and shows very little sign of slowing down, although there has been a slowdown in the Chinese economy. Russia's total footprint on economic footprint in Africa is much, much smaller. It's in the sort of $1 to $10 billion range, so it's 20 times smaller at least than China. South Africa, for example, has negligible trade with Russia. There's some fruit and vegetables, there's some minerals, but really Russia's total trade with Africa is similar in size to Turkey's total trade in Africa. So there is a lot of room for growth. The geopolitics is also looming around, but as I said, what we've seen at these various points, 2008, 2014, 2022, increased Russian businessmen coming to the continent, increased deals. But compared to China, Russia's trade with Africa is very small. Its biggest trading partner is Egypt, and about 40% of its trade goes to Egypt. A lot of that is grain and weaponry. In economic terms, Russia is not a big player. So there must be something else that attracts it to the continent and the continent to it. And I think part of that is support in international forums like the United Nations. I think it's Russia's looking for diplomatic support. It's trying to show that the Western sanctions have not isolated it as much as people think. So Russia's keen to host events, not least of which was the second Russia-Africa summit in 2023. Economically, it's negligible. It's really a small player economically. I think the Gulf states have probably invested more into Africa than Russia has.
And when we read discourse on official Russian websites, it's always that President Putin is instructing Manturov and other people try to find new markets, try to find new export markets. So in sense, can we say that Russia doesn't have much to offer, or the Russian business people are not doing their job and the activity like promoting Russian trade, export and everything is not that visible?
So one of the companies I haven't mentioned yet is Rosatom, and they are at various stages of negotiating nuclear power deals with about 20 countries, we believe. They attempted to do so in South Africa, and when the government changed from Jacob Zuma to Cyril Ramaphosa, and because of a court case, that deal was was cancelled. It was going to be very, very expensive. I would have been paying for it for 60 years, and my children and grandchildren would have been paying for it as well. So it was seen as unaffordable despite our electricity crisis that we have. So yes, we don't really see big delegations of Russian business people in South Africa, and too much on the continent. Um, it may well be that Russia doesn't sell what Africa needs to buy, but certainly I think one of the wake-up calls to many African countries has been their dependence on both Russia and Ukraine for grains and wheat. And with the troubles in the Black Sea, a lot of that's not been able to be exported and has really impacted on food security in the continent. So I think Russian businesses could do more if they see these as important new markets. Again, I'm not a businessman, and it's not something that I have firsthand knowledge of, but my sense is it's very low key. Um, uh, but what we have had, certainly when there've been Russian delegations, sometimes there's small protests by the Ukrainian Association of South Africa and so forth. So it would have come to my attention. So I think despite the imperative to seek new markets, I don't see enough work really being done to exploit those markets and to connect them, because as we've said, the total trade numbers are very low.
Let's naturally go to energy projects, as you mentioned, Rosatom. We know Rosatom is building a nuclear plant in Egypt.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, there are negotiations. But those negotiations, we should take it with moderation, because we know how long it takes to negotiate a nuclear power plant. I would like to ask you, what's the perception of the Russian energy companies in Africa? And are they more welcome to implement projects? Or those companies are more sort of speculating about how to get natural resources, and the finance, the technology, and everything that comes with energy projects is slightly neglected? Because when you mention negotiations, many of those negotiations, they are struggling with funding. Because technology might be there, the international cooperation also is possible, but for some reason Russia is not utilizing the funding. So this is my interest, that you have like Gazprom, you have Rosatom, you have Rosneft, big corporations with big profit and property. And still I can't see that many projects. I see some projects in the Middle East, but it's usually with cooperation with the local companies. But independently, I think the Egypt is perhaps the best example for Russia in terms of energy projects.
Indeed. So Russia is constructing this nuclear power plant in Dabaa in Egypt, and that has commenced. But you're right, there are many negotiations which are. I think nuclear always takes a long time to negotiate, to build, to operate, and I think there are some concerns still from the public around safety, which Africa has declared itself a nuclear weapons-free zone. So we're not talking about atomic weapons. We're talking about civilian technology, whether it's medical or power. Africa has an abundance of resources, but it still has great trouble with energy. In South Africa, for example, I think about 90% of our energy still comes from coal. And we've had a period of about 15 years where we have a phenomenon called load shedding, which is basically the government switches off the electricity grid in your area for between 2 and 4 hours because, say it needs 20 gigawatts and it only has 18, it has to switch off 2 gigawatts worth of power. And although we have mighty rivers like the Inga Dam that is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that's been talked about for 20 years, building a hydroelectric power plant, and it really hasn't progressed very far. So I think one of the issues is that a lot of the um, countries are different. Africa is not a country. There are different types of governments. There are different types of natural resources. There are different histories, and as much as there are many similarities, there also are many differences. So I don't think it's just Russia that's struggling, but and no African countries have put sanctions on Russia in this conflict. Nevertheless, I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it's just a very competitive market. Maybe there's political pressure behind the scenes. But as you rightly say, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of desire, but just in the implementation, it doesn't seem to follow through.
And Steven, is there interest from the African side to approach those companies? Can you see any initiatives in Africa? Let's say we want to have Russian energy partnerships. We want to build this plant. We want to build some solar energy projects. Or this is only in sort of theoretical talking?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, I'm not sure I'm the best one to answer at that. Uh, I think Russia competes with France and the US and the EU and many other players. So I don't see people saying we have to have Russian technology for this. They are the best. They are the cheapest. They are the most reliable partner. I don't see too much of that, to be honest. So going back to one of your earlier questions, yes, I think if Russia wants the business, it is going to have to work harder. And a lot of business is also based on trust. And so again, we go back to where we started in the very long-standing historical ties. But I think sometimes Russia is viewed, how can I put it? It's viewed as a very closed place, a very opaque, untransparent country. And people worry, I think businesses worry about their reputation, perhaps even secondary sanctions, if it were to go into business with Russian companies. That's just a feeling I have. But I think there is some depth to that, and it's not easy. Doing business in Africa is not easy, and I think Russia is encountering some of the problems that other big players are also encountering.
Let's move to diplomacy. We know how President Putin and African leaders, they were announcing the Russia-Africa summit. And Russia-Africa summit is something that it's well promoted. It's promoted as something like a multipolarity, the new multipolarity in the world. It's something like Russia is helping to create a new international order. And we have those narratives around. But then we're trying to find some statements like what was achieved, what is going to be implemented. And then we are slightly struggling. So let's clarify the real behind the scenes of the Russia-Africa summit and how the Russian diplomacy is perceived by African leaders. And perhaps you can add some commentary based on your research and practice, because you are from South Africa and you see this in your real life.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think the diplomatic field has been one where Russia has tried to demonstrate that it is not as isolated as the West would like to think that it is. So, for example, the BRICS summit last year in Kazan was a very big event. Russia initiated a whole lot of projects, including sports events and artistic shows and things of that nature. Yes, there have been two Russian Africa summits, the first one in 2019 and the second one in 2023, both held in Russia. Part of the reason that they were meant to be held every 3 years, but they were held over for a year, I think partly because of the war in Ukraine, but also I understand disagreements between African countries as to who would actually host that summit. So the candidates were understood to be Egypt and Ethiopia, which are now both in the BRICS. But they have a long-standing tension about the Nile River because Ethiopia has built the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, a massive dam on the river, and Egypt is very worried about being starved of water. So they don't always have great relations. And my understanding is not one of them would allow the other one to host the summit. But look, if you're having a summit of um, uh, inviting 55 African states, you must have some ties with them going into that. So while some trace this new relationship of Russia with Africa from 2019, yes, it was a step up, but you have to have laid the groundwork in all of these countries for them to buy into this summit. So I'm sure Russia would like to host, and Africa would like to host the next meeting. We'll see. I think diplomatically, the ICC case against President Putin on the alleged taking of children from Ukraine into Russia, and therefore the ICC has issued an indictment of President Putin. That certainly played into the politics here of the BRICS summit in 2023. Because in the end, President Putin did not travel to South Africa. Russia was represented by Minister Lavrov, who has come to South Africa quite frequently. And I think that's another thing to mention is that we've seen over the last couple of years that high-level officials from many countries have been visiting various countries in Africa, not always South Africa, but Lavrov will take a trip to 5 or 6 countries. But we've seen Macron come. We've seen in the Biden administration, senior officials like Antony Blinken have come to Africa. I think in the Trump era, we're likely to see a neglect of Africa by the US. It's not important to him. It doesn't feature on his radar apart from tariffs. And South Africa is a special case because the US-South Africa relations are really at a low point. Some people say they can't get lower, but it is my experience that they can get much lower than they are. But there's been a lot of tension with the Trump administration. But that is to say, I think if the US is less interested in Africa, that gives the opportunity for other players, China, Russia, EU, to strengthen their ties. In his first term, he wasn't really interested in Africa. He never visited. Biden only came once, and that was in the last few days of his presidency. He came to Angola to examine the Lobito corridor, which is a big infrastructure corridor to export minerals, trying to rival the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So that was Biden's sole trip to Africa. So if we talk about the marginalization of the continent, apart from exceptions like South Africa, I don't think Africa features on the American radar at the moment. And the big question, which is both a diplomatic and an economic question, is since 2000, there has been what's called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, which is a trade concession by the US. It's an American law. It's not a negotiated trade deal. It's coming from the American side, where they open a lot of their markets to African exports. That is due to expire in September. And given the story on the tariffs and the way that has gone, most observers do not think that AGOA will be renewed and that there will be bilateral trade deals that have to be struck. But certainly the commentary in South Africa is because of the deteriorating relations with Washington, very, very unlikely that South Africa's benefits from AGOA will be renewed. And that's very concerning because we export a lot of vehicles to the US, fruits and vegetables, and wine. Those are the 3 big industries. And many jobs could be lost if those concessions are taken away.
Right. Steven, regarding diplomacy, can you distinguish between the BRICS group and Africa and Russia Africa summit as two, let's say, instruments or two vectors how Russia is pursuing interest? Because I think that's quite important also to explain how Russia is using those international
Yeah.
instruments in pursuing its interest.
Yes, so let's start with the Russia-Africa relationship. I think as I said earlier, complicated by multiple countries with multiple kinds of governments, multiple economic strengths and weaknesses. So it's a lot of work. Um, Russia, like China, I think prefers to work bilaterally. Yes, some support is given to the African Union, and I think the big opportunity for all external players as well as internal African economies is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has been signed and ratified and is going into implementation. Um, I that would be if I were an external partner where I would be focusing my energy. But I think the Russia-Africa summits are less frequent. Um, they follow this pattern of the kind of one to many, one Russia and many African countries. As I said, there were complications in hosting the second summit in Africa, so it had to be moved to Russia, again to St. Petersburg. And I think it's less frequent, and the bilateral ties are very much more important. On the BRICS side, I definitely think that Russia and China both see BRICS as a very important forum. It started out with Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Then, with Russian support and Chinese support, South Africa was admitted from 2011. And then it went for a long time with no further members. It launched the New Development Bank in 2015, and then in South Africa in October 2023, the big expansion of BRICS occurred, where 7 countries, I think, were offered membership. So Argentina was offered membership, but declined when they had a change of government. Indonesia was offered membership, but they said they're having an election and they don't want to do it now. It has, in the last few months, actually joined BRICS. Ethiopia, Egypt, both accepted. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates were asked from the Middle East, as well as Iran. Iran and UAE accepted. Saudi Arabia is an ambiguous case. It is neither fully accepted nor fully rejected. So it does come to some meetings, but not to other meetings. So I was in Brazil recently doing research on BRICS, and they said, well, we consider them in until we have a formal notification that they're out. And I think they also are having a big eye on their relations with the US. It's all really, we live in such an interconnected world. So BRICS has expanded. It's now double the size with the new countries. I think Russia wanted to expand it even further, especially at the Kazan summit. What we had then was a kind of compromise where a new category of membership called partners was put into place with a dozen or so countries, around about a dozen countries. But I think that was pushed back from the other BRICS members who were not keen to expand further until the new countries had really settled in. So I think in that way, it was a bit of a diplomatic setback for Russia. But the fact that it managed to bring all the BRICS leaders and the new BRICS members and many African countries as guests to Kazan in 2024 was really significant, and was a way again of Russia showing that it's not isolated, or as isolated as the West would think. Brazil is going to be hosting the BRICS summit in a couple of months. They're very keen to consolidate the structures of BRICS, because they did an exercise to count how many different instruments and forums there were, and they got to nearly 200, which is just a huge amount. Russia also had a lot of meetings for BRICS. which Brazil has cut down on. So there are different priorities, but definitely I think Russia regards BRICS as a very, very important place for it to exercise its diplomacy, to share its view of the world, along with something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well. So Russia wields a lot of power within BRICS.
And can you see any BRICS initiatives, for instance, led by Russia, regarding academic cooperation, maybe cooperation between the institutes, or perhaps imagine that there is a student, an African student interested in political science and international relations. Is there any opportunity for him or her to get involved in some cooperation? So there is sort of that soft power
Yeah.
slightly under the diplomatic coverage.
Yeah. I mean, I was privileged enough to visit Moscow last year. We spoke to many of the universities and think tanks that work on Russia. And what struck me was that these academics were feeling very isolated because many of their projects with American and European universities or institutes had been cancelled. And so they were very keen to find places to publish, to look for academic collaboration with South Africa. BRICS does have mechanisms where think tanks and researchers interact, most notably the Academic Forum, which will be in Brazil. I think it's in Brasilia in June or July. So there are existing structures, but how easy it is for me as a student at South African University who wants to do my master's in Moscow, how easy is it for me to find out? It strikes me that it's probably not so easy. I think educational diplomacy is also a very contested marketplace. So good students could probably take their pick of whether they wanted to go to Russia or China or a Western university, if they really do well. If I were in that position, I guess I would knock on the door of the Russian embassy and say, what opportunities are there? Is there somebody who can assist me? I haven't tried. I haven't tried to study in Russia, so I don't. I can't speak from firsthand experience. But if you had to say to me, what is the name of the Russian student exchange program, I couldn't tell you. I don't know. I think also one of the barriers is the language. Certainly, when we were in Russia last year, one of the refrains that we heard quite often was that there's very little Russian language taught in Africa. There's very little Russian cultural engagement. Some of that is done through the embassy. But you also have the phenomenon that the Russian embassy has been a little bit isolated from the Western embassies in South Africa, for example. So there's also a little diplomatic battle going on at that level. But I think there is a lot of room for academic collaboration. I think Russia sees the Global South as a very lucrative academic market. But perhaps Russia needs to be a bit more forthright with the offerings that it has for students to attract the best ones.
Let's turn the page and let's speak a little bit about peacekeeping and counterterrorism. We know how Russia is involved in peacekeeping and terrorism in Africa. However, the perception of the Ukraine crisis and the war, sometimes now people are questioning, should Russia be involved in peacekeeping missions? Should it be internationally accepted in the peacekeeping missions when we hear and when we read those stories about the missiles dropping on Ukraine? And the second question or sub-question is about terrorism. The collaboration between the West and Russia regarding terrorism has been decreasing because of the Ukraine conflict, but it's still going because terrorism is a global issue. How is that in Africa?
Well, I think on peacekeeping, I think it's suffering from the same problems that we see elsewhere in the UN system and in geopolitics generally. I think maybe things are changing now with President Trump, who is close to President Putin, has spoken to him, whereas Biden did not. Trump has tried to bring the war to an end, not successfully yet. Although he said he could end it in 24 hours, I think his first 100 days have shown him how difficult it is. So I think some of this shunning of Russia that happens in international organizations seeps through to peacekeeping as well. And it may, I can understand why it may be difficult for Russian peacekeepers to be accepted in many countries. On terrorism, of course, Africa probably suffers from the worst terrorism anywhere in the world in terms of numbers, of incidents. And if you look at the map and you draw a line from, say, Senegal over to Somaliland, south of that line, you will find many Islamist terrorist groups from Al-Shabaab to Boko Haram to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because these are huge countries that have ungoverned spaces. These are countries that the capital is not able to exert power over. They are desert, semi-desert and desert countries, which makes for difficult terrain. So I think that terrorism is something that Africa, and it doesn't always make the news. It's actually very seldom makes the news. But if you look at the statistics of number of bombs and number of people killed, Africa has far more incidents than we ever hear of in Europe or anywhere else in the world. But when something does happen in Berlin or Brussels or New York or indeed Moscow, I think it makes headlines. So Africa has a huge terrorism problem, and I think it would look for assistance. I mean, I always think back to 9/11, and that was already 25 years ago, 24 years ago. One of the first calls that came into President Bush was from President Putin on terrorism, and I think unfortunately we have moved so far from those times that Russia and its relations with Western countries are really in tatters. Again, maybe changing with President Trump, and we've already seen some of that, but a lot of work to do there. So I think terrorism is an area that's something. Anti-terrorism is something Russia can offer, but again, in our contemporary world, it has to compete in the marketplace.
You're right, because when I was lecturing about terrorism in Africa in Prague this year, I also told my students that the incidents are unreported because there are no journalists. I said, imagine that you are in Mali or you are in the North Mozambique and you're trying to get a trace, like what's going on. So you, for instance, have one car, maybe one translator or interpreter coming with you, maybe one assistant, and that's it. But the area is like the whole Germany.
You're very right. And I think a lot of the governments don't let journalists in because they don't want to, give the terrorists more publicity, but also they don't want to show how really poorly their own government is doing in trying to stem this problem.
There is a connection to foreign aid. And in the West, the foreign aid to Africa is always portrayed as a charity activity or activities for charities. And there are many controversies, like you contribute £1, but the real contribution is perhaps 5 cents that goes to Africa, because charity and foreign aid to Africa is a big business. We might critically admit that. Do you see any activities from Russia in this area? And if so, how it is received by people?
Yeah, I think the short answer is very little. Russia does not have the budget that the Soviet Union had. I think ideology has changed and so forth. But as you rightly point out, aid is a big industry, and it's an industry that is under huge pressure because Trump has basically dismantled USAID, the US Agency for International Development, cut hundreds and thousands of programs, actually put people's lives at risk. For example, if they were getting antiretroviral drugs for HIV, literally people die if they don't get those drugs. So it's put many people out of a job in the US and around the continent. We're also seeing this from other traditional generous aid donors. I mean, when Sir Keir Starmer was in the US, he announced that 40% of Britain's aid budget was going to be spent on the military. I think we are seeing military spending in Europe rising, and Trump is also driving that because he wants European countries to take more ownership and more responsibility for their own security. So we may see, we'll see what happens with NATO, which looks very strong under Biden. But if America pulls out, or pulls back, what does that mean? And we're not sure. So I don't see a lot of evidence of aid in the same way as the West offers. I think Russia tends to offer a package that is heavily composed of skills, of people, of personnel that can help with various challenges that countries have, but it does not have, to my knowledge, the massive agencies that Britain or Germany or Sweden have, or the US. But again, as I say, there's a lot of change in those countries. We see, I think, post-COVID, but also with the war, with the wars in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine, those countries diverting money that would have gone to aid is now going to the military. And the other big factor, of course, is migration. Many of those donor countries are dealing with thousands and hundreds of thousands of refugees from Africa and from elsewhere. And they are putting money both into trying to help those that have already made it to their shores, but much more importantly, they want to invest in stopping the boats and stopping people leave their countries in the first place. So yeah, Russia plays differently. I don't think it's a player in the same vein.
What about Russian diaspora in Africa? We know that this is sort of trendy topic to write about foreign policy and diaspora. How can you elaborate on that, and what sort of trends can you see?
Yeah, I must be honest. I don't know. Couldn't tell you how many Russians there are in South Africa and whether the numbers have increased or not. Certainly, it's not something that's been in the news or too noticeable. To me, there isn't a very big Russian diaspora in South Africa compared to somewhere like Israel, where 1 million Russian speakers moved, in a short period of time in the 90s. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have very much Russian language newspapers or anything like that. I'm not aware of it. But yeah, I don't think. I mean, what I have encountered on my travels around Africa are individual Russians here and there. So I was very surprised when I was in Sierra Leone that both the pilot of the ferry that takes you over the Leone River from the airport to Freetown was Russian. And it was a very crowded ferry, and we were not keen to go on the ferry on the way back. So we took the helicopter, and the helicopter was also flown by an ex-Russian. So, yeah, I think there's probably there probably are, Russian citizens all dotted all around the country, but I don't think it's a significant diaspora compared to Europe, for example.
Right. We already touched a topic of information and disinformation, and you already spoke about a few examples how Russia is pursuing its interests through media. And now I would like to ask you from different perspective. In Russia, they portrayed Russian media as media that are independent, telling the true stories, the facts, and all that. How is it in real life in Africa? That's the first question. And the second question, do you see increased activities in Russian media covering Africa and trying to get more channels for people, maybe more movies, maybe more shows or talk shows? Or do you think that Russia doesn't have a huge impact through Russian media in Africa?
So I've written a little bit about this, Russia's soft power in Africa. And one of the examples that came up was the movie Tourist, set in Central African Republic, which was really about Russian mercenary forces in a real kind of heroic, gritty portrayal. Look, I think RT, for example, has had a major setback at the beginning of the war because RT used to broadcast on our satellite company called MultiChoice. It used to be in with all the other news channels. It was number 407. But very soon after the war, a few weeks after the war started, you just get a page when you go to that channel that shows you a diagram of where the signal's coming from. Basically, the signal comes through Europe for RT. And because the Europeans had banned it, it meant that it could not be broadcast in Africa, or certainly in South Africa. So some felt that this was a shame because it took the Russian point of view off our bouquet of news channels, so we can watch BBC or radio or CNN or Al Jazeera or Deutsche Welle, but we didn't have this perspective from Russia. But others felt that it was a propaganda channel, that it was would always take the most negative spin on when the protagonists involved were Western, and always romanticize and boost the protagonists when they were Russian. So that was a big setback. So I think one of the things that RT then tried was to have a presence on the internet in Africa, and they were producing, I think, only 1 hour a week of a documentary. That seems to have also fallen away. Having said that, in my example that I mentioned earlier is, I think it still remains very influential in social media, especially in West Africa, in French, which is interesting. I've also went to the RT building when I was in Moscow, and it has a massive French, Spanish, English, Arabic operations going. So yeah, I think it's unfortunate that we don't get RT, but I have to say many were very skeptical about the narrative and the version of things that were being shown there. So yeah, that's. But certainly at the Russia-Africa summits, media has been a topic, and Russia has trained journalists, brought journalists to Russia. Has agreements with many TV stations and media organizations to use Russian material. So yeah, I think that's for me what the picture looks like.
The last question, Steven, for today's interview is about your opinion about research on Russia and Africa. There are students, there are young researchers, maybe there are some colleagues watching us. What would you recommend as under-researched areas in this field? And perhaps you can mention maybe your project that you're working on to give inspiration for people to not be afraid to research this topic, despite it sounds complicated, complex, and maybe sometimes you need sort of, you struggle to find information about Africa and Russia unless you are involved in some sort of high politics.
Thank you. Yes, so my project here at the South African Institute of International Affairs is called our Africa-Russia project. We try and understand the dynamics of the increased Russian presence in Africa from all angles: military, security, economic, political, diplomatic. We've published a number of papers, and we continue to publish papers on our website under the program page on Africa-Russia. We do frequent commentary in the media, and some of those spots are also uploaded to the SIAS website. So we also try and follow developments. We are able to travel to Russia, which is very important, I think, to see things firsthand. I had a very positive experience, and really value my time that I was able to spend in Moscow last year. So we're active on social media. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's probably not enough work on Russia-Africa economic ties, on where what the growth areas could be. I think another area that's underreported is on the diplomatic side. Russia's relations with Africa. I mean, there are a couple of books, one by a good friend of mine, Sam Ramani, called Russia in Africa. But that's, I think, the first full-length book that doesn't go country by country, but it does look at many of these bilateral relationships. So I think that's important. I think naturally there'll be a lot of work on the Sahel and on Russia's involvement there. I think there's a lot of scope to examine information and disinformation, particularly on social media. And French West Africa is a very interesting place to look at that. So those would be some of the areas that I think people could get more involved in.
Steven, thank you very much for your time and for your insightful thoughts about Africa and Russia. I think it is a fascinating topic to research, no matter what nationality you are, because we have the biggest country in the world. We have an African continent, and both those territories, they go through rapid dynamic changes. So therefore, what you research today is already updating tomorrow, basically. So that's quite interesting, and also that's quite useful to know. Steve, again, thank you very much for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you, Martin.